I'm just back from a weekend of donking people with my poleaxe, and I've got a few more insights about poleaxes used in a battlefield context to share with you. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. So this weekend I was at the amazing Tewkesbury Medieval Festival, which there's some footage I'm going to put in here, which is courtesy of Alex the History Guy, incidentally. So kudos to him. I'll stick a link down below to his channel as well. Now, this was a fantastic weekend. As many of you know, I go to this every year now, at least when I can. And it is a reenactment, so I think it's Europe's biggest free medieval festival and reenactment for attendees to go and visit and watch. There's tens of thousands of attendees over the weekend. It's absolutely huge, and there's a couple of thousand people, reenactors actually involved in recreating the battle. There's cannons, there's handguns, there's archers, there's knights, men-at-arms like me, and then there's loads of billmen and so on and so forth. So there's a variety of medieval soldiers. Now, obviously this is reenactment. Now, I have a certain amount of experience with poleaxes in an armoured context and in a HEMA context and in a one-on-one context. But believe it or not, this is literally the first time in my life that I have ever used a poleaxe, this actual blunt reenactment poleaxe I've got here. The first time I've actually ever used a poleaxe in a sort of melee or battlefield scenario. Now, obviously, poleaxes are dangerous things. This is a real steel weapon. It weighs the same as the real thing. And despite the fact that it's blunt, it's got a blunt point and a blunt axe and all that kind of stuff, you can do an awful lot of damage with these. Now, obviously, when we're doing reenactment, we're dressed in period clothes. There's no modern safety gear. In many cases, there's no face protection. So there are basic rules we have to observe, and we are essentially play fighting. Okay, sometimes it gets a bit rough, sometimes people are a little bit more enthusiastic than others, but most of the time it's really good natured. I personally didn't see any injuries. I certainly didn't receive any injuries. I picked up some scratches on my new armour, but that's absolutely fine. That's what it's for. And it was all very good natured, but when you are using this, you do have to be careful. And that was one of the things that I was most aware of going into this, was that yes, I'm used to using wooden or rubber headed poleaxes and smacking people really hard in a HEMA context, but you can't do that in a reenactment context with a steel headed poleaxe, particularly where people have got variable amounts of armour. Obviously you can hit a piece of armour fairly hard, but you certainly don't want to be hitting anywhere around the head or face. In this particular kind of situation, thrusts have to be kept low for obvious safety reasons, and many of the people out there are billmen in nothing but a gambus and some gauntlets and a helmet. So at the minimum level, you have to have helmet and gauntlets. So some people don't have an awful lot of protection. They might not have any leg protection, for example. So you have to be mindful the whole time when you're fighting about not only the person you're fighting and what protective equipment they've got, and pulling and stopping your blows such that you don't injure them, but additionally you've got to be looking at the people around you as well, because with a weapon this long, obviously it's got two ends as well. I've got a back spike here, and I've got a, it's a blunt, but still you wouldn't want that in your face kind of spike at the top here. You've got to be watching when you're fighting someone here, who's here, who's behind you the whole time. You can't swing the thing back here and clunk someone in the face with the back end of your poleaxe. So you've got to be fairly careful, and you've got to have good situational awareness. But all of these things aside, nevertheless, this was the first time I'd used a poleaxe in a massed environment where people were poking me with spears and bills, mainly, sometimes swords as well. Some people charging in and sort of grappling and body checking, core a core type stuff, and getting smashed in with loads of other people, some of which wearing armour, some of which only in light armour. And it was a very, very interesting experience. So what are the things that I learned from this about my poleaxe, which I didn't necessarily really realise so much before? So one of the first things that became really stark is when you're fighting against an enemy bill block, which might have men-at-arms mixed in with it, or indeed if it's just a group of men-at-arms, the poleaxe, despite the fact that many of you might think of this as a striking weapon, and absolutely you can strike very, very powerfully with it, when you're massed in with a load of people, and when there's a mass of people in front of you, and when they're closing on you, pretty much I find the most useful bit of the poleaxe is the spear point, is the tip. So despite the fact you have obviously got a hammer or a side spike and an axe, all these kinds of things, which are very, very useful in single combat, in massed combat, because of the nature of the squished in environment, the point is often your most useful part of the weapon, and sometimes that might mean the back point as well, of course. And an interesting thing here, I'll talk more about the shape of the head in a minute, because that's one of the other observations. If you are just thrusting, sometimes it is better balanced to be thrusting with the back end, because of course the weight of the head is much heavier than the weight of the tail, or queue as it's sometimes called in French. So if you just want to use it as a spear, you're actually in some ways better using that end than this end. However, there is a way that using the head end is advantageous. That is specifically against opposing pole weapons. So if we imagine the opposing pole weapons are coming in straight lines like this, one of the problems with spears, or indeed rapiers or small swords, any kind of straight thrusting object without lateral bars, is that you can stab each other quite easily at the same time. So if you're stabbing me with a spear, I can be stabbing you with a spear, and the two things easily go past each other. Not the case when you have a pole weapon that has side bars or side extensions like this one does here. And obviously that would apply also to something like a corset or a sputum or a partisan, a halberd, a bill, or a poleaxe. So when you're facing thrusting spears or bills at you, having these sideways extensions are incredibly useful. Now, I always knew that, and I've talked about it in previous videos. And in fact, if we look at poleaxe treatises, just where it's one poleaxe versus one poleaxe, these top parts here are used for blocking. So even if someone swings an axe at your head, you can actually catch or aim to catch the downcoming blow. So it basically hits the side of this spike here and slides down and gets caught in this crook. So one of the reasons, it's not just about having an axe or having a hammer, one of the reasons that these are shaped like this is to catch stuff in, okay? So in a forwards direction you can catch stuff, and something that I had a lot of fun doing actually, so people who are using bills, they'll often thrust at you to stab you, but they'll often use their hook to try and get around some bit of your armour or around your leg, and you can do exactly the same thing to them. And one of the beautiful things of the poleaxe, yes, it is shorter than most bills, is as that bill comes in, what I was having fun doing is pinning the bill or spear to the ground, okay? So using this like a fork and ramming it down to the ground, and of course on earth, on grass and mud, when you push a pointy object down at the ground, it tends to go into the ground. So what I was doing, and I did a number of times against people in the opposite line, who are mostly the Beauforts actually, shout out to you, the blue and whites coming at us, was pushing the bill point down on the ground. Now in one case, someone, I think with a spear, if I remember correctly, came at me, and I think they'd probably caught my breastplate a couple of times already, so they did hit me, but I managed to jam their spear down onto the ground, and then I did pure fury. I managed to stand on the end of their spear, so I basically took it down to the ground here, stood on it, and then I had a free thrust at them. And this is obviously just generic good technique, so it might be reenactment, but you can use HEMA techniques so long as you do it safely, and you get a lot of insights into how these things work in a multiple opponent scenario. Now, pushing down is one thing, pushing down with a tip. Obviously, you can also hook and pull in the same way that a bill can. And in fact, one person on our Facebook page actually commented, I got into a tug of war with him, and this was really, really funny. So his intention was obviously to try and pull my poleaxe out of my hand. So he used his bill hook to grab onto my poleaxe hook, essentially, and he started pulling, and I started pulling, and we had a bit of a tug of war, and it was a stalemate. So we unhooked ourselves and carried on. Obviously, if someone is pulling you, you can turn that into a thrust, but again, in a reenactment environment, you've got to be a little bit careful about that, because obviously you don't want a thrust to go into someone's face, especially if they don't expect it. So we had a good old tug of war, and that just illustrates that these poleaxes can hook pretty much as well as a bill can. Now, one thing about that is length, okay? So the next thing is length. Now, generally speaking, having reach in a fight is an advantage, right? Because a billman who's got a longer bill, because bills are usually much longer than a poleaxe, can hit you before you can hit them. That's true. But there are two very noticeable ways in this particular environment where having the shorter weapon is actually advantageous. One of those is leverage. So if we have, for example, hooked onto each other, because your end of your weapon, your bill, is further away from your hands, at least most of the time on average, it's therefore a more manipulatable lever. Okay, it's the end of a long lever. This is a shorter lever, and therefore I'm more able to manipulate the end of yours with it, okay? The other one is space, okay, simply space. So if we come in close, and I found this previously when I went to Tewkesbury and I fought with a spear, I went in with a particularly big spear, and I actually found it a massive disadvantage in that particular environment. As soon as we came close, I was just having to drop the spear and get my sword out, or dagger if I'd had one, but I didn't have a dagger at that time. Because the spear was too unwieldy in this kind of closed-in mass. Whereas the poleaxe, beautifully, because of its length, it has some of the advantages of a long polearm. And obviously you can hold the thing at the back and strike someone who's over behind the front enemy line, or hook indeed from a long way away. But if people come close, you can quickly slide the thing up close, and you end up with really quite a close weapon and two ends. You can block high and low for the whole length of your body. You can block things coming in at your legs. You can donk the head really close, so you can still, and you can push away with the middle. These are all classic things that you find in poleaxe treatises, and I've taught in one-on-one combat, that are incredibly useful with this length of weapon in this type of close melee combat, which longer polearms are more unwieldy in. Right, the final thing I'm going to mention about this poleaxe, using in this particular scenario, is the choking up that I've just mentioned to. Okay, so one interesting thing was this had a guard on it. So if I just grab my sharp poleaxe for a minute, you will notice that a lot of poleaxes have hand guards on like this, okay, a disc guard. Now they do have some advantages, obviously, they protect your hand. If your hand's butted up behind here, then you're less likely to get points and stuff like that into the top of your gauntlet. Blows coming down are less likely to break your thumb and this kind of stuff, okay. However, there were problems, although this blunt one came with a guard on it, there were problems with the way it was attached and it was rattling. I just removed it. Now that wasn't purely because there were problems with the guard, it was based on prior experience in training HEMA single poleaxe combat. There are a number of techniques in the treatises. Primarily, I'd recommend Le Jeu de la Hache, which is a French poleaxe treatise, or the anonymous Bolognese treatise, which contains a really good poleaxe section. They're the best two treatises for poleaxe, in my opinion. And there are a number of techniques where you want to be able to slide your hand up to the head. One example might be because you're using the cue, you're using the back end. Another example might be because you're very, very close, and there's one example where you put this under an armpit and push someone away. But overall, the ability to slide the hand up and down the shaft from full top to bottom is really advantageous. And the problem with having these guards is they get in the way. That incidentally is also, when you're looking at a poleaxe, if you want to buy one, have a look at the languettes as well. You don't really want things which are going to obstruct or hurt your hand sliding up and down and moving up and down the shaft. You want to be able to slide up and down your shaft as much as you like and easily without hurting yourself. So quite simply, I felt no detriment, no drawbacks to not having a guard on here. Admittedly, I've got really good mitten gauntlets, and so hits on my gauntlets for the most part don't do me any harm, and I don't remember even getting any anyway. But by and large, for simple dexterity, I prefer not having a guard on my poleaxe, or any other polearm for that matter. Anyway, these are my first insights. I'm sure I'll think about more things and we'll talk more about this topic in the future. If you've got specific questions, they might spur future videos as well. So don't be afraid to post down below. Even if you think it's a silly question, it might not be. It might actually be a great question, or it might just make me think about something else that I've forgotten to mention, or I have something to talk about. But overall, I loved using a poleaxe. I only used, in 2 days of battle, or 2 days of reenactment, I only used my sword once. And it was fun using the sword, but I think I only used it for about 30 seconds, maybe a minute. This absolutely was the main weapon that I used for the whole time, and I didn't really feel a need to put it down or switch to any other weapon. It was brilliant. It was brilliant as a polearm. It was good against other polearms. It was good against swords. It was good up close. It was good at range. What a fantastic, versatile weapon. Last thing I'll mention, one thing I sort of knew, but again, I sort of felt more viscerally in this reenactment context. When you're wearing medieval shoes, when you're on dry, sun-baked earth and grass, it can get quite slippery. And a poleaxe is really freaking useful when you're walking up a slippery slope. It is a little bit like a giant armed fighting walking stick, and it is really, really useful actually having as a prop and having a thing to lean against. And I really, going up some of those slopes, particularly after the battles where I was very tired, having this to lean on and to give me essentially a third support, as well as my legs, was really, really useful. So overall, I absolutely loved this thing. I want to get more poleaxes now, and it was absolutely fantastic. Anyway, thanks again for watching. If you're not liked and subscribed already on this video, please make sure you are, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks!